Lewis Hamilton is closer than ever to rejoining Mercedes. Earlier today, an audio leak emerged of Lewis confessing that he misses working with the team. Do you think that's pure coincidence? Do you want to find out if there have been behind-the-scenes negotiations between Hamilton and Mercedes to make his return a reality? If this has caught your attention, stick around until the end and you'll know the whole truth. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. All season, the tension had been building in the background, never exploding outright but pulsing under every media appearance, every team meeting, every split second on track. By the time the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend wrapped, it finally broke the surface, not in a dramatic on-air confrontation or a heated exchange caught by microphones, but in something far more revealing. Lewis Hamilton, standing in a quieter corner of the paddock, speaking in a low tone to someone from his tight-knit inner circle, let slip a few words he hadn't planned to make public. "I miss Ferrari," he said, almost as though testing how it felt to admit it out loud. Those 3 words, once they leaked, didn't just make headlines, they reshaped the narrative of his entire season. It wasn't nostalgia in its simplest form. It wasn't the romanticized image of him waving to the Tifosi, or the thrill of driving through the Monza haze, or the ceremonial weight of wearing the most iconic race suit in the sport. It was something far messier, the recognition that, despite the politics, the frustrations, and the slow erosion of trust, there was still a part of him bound to that chapter of his career. A part built from moments of raw passion and hard-earned respect, from endless hours spent dissecting data in engineering rooms, from risks taken and sometimes rewarded. The connection had been forged in a pressure cooker, and for better or worse, it had left a mark that wouldn't fade easily. Inside Maranello, the reality had been growing harsher with every race. The public facade of unity was still intact, the teams smiling together in photo ops, praising each other in carefully worded interviews, but the undercurrent was one of strain. Hamilton was under a microscope. The leadership didn't need to shout. Their expectations were communicated in every sideways glance, every comparison to Charles Leclerc's results. The numbers told a story that was impossible to ignore. Leclerc was consistently on the podium, Hamilton wasn't. And while on the surface that was simply a performance metric, beneath it lay something deeper, a team culture increasingly tailored to one driver's strengths. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Ferrari's engineers weren't malicious in their intent, but the development path had long been set in motion. Small aerodynamic shifts, subtle adjustments to suspension geometry, tweaks in the balance philosophy, all of it catered to Leclerc's driving DNA. His style favored a car that rewarded smooth, progressive inputs and stability under load. Hamilton's natural instincts, honed over years of success, thrived on sharper rotation, a responsive front end, a car that danced unpredictably but answered instantly. The SF-25 in its updated form didn't meet him halfway. The more upgrades came through, the more it felt like the machine was drifting away from him, asking him to bend his style to its limitations rather than the other way around. That mismatch translated into every lap. The steering lacked the immediate bite he trusted when committing to corners at high speed. The rear end, while composed for Leclerc's finesse, felt overly anchored, refusing to pivot with the urgency Hamilton craved. Even when the stopwatch said the lap was quick, it didn't feel right, it didn't feel like his lap. Driving became a constant act of compromise, of calculating how much of his own instinct he could sacrifice without losing too much performance in return. In technical briefings, the conversation tilted further toward data-driven validation of the existing development approach. Charts and telemetry backed up decisions that kept the car's character fixed in Leclerc's image. Hamilton's feedback, no matter how precise, often ended up filed away as driver preference rather than integrated into the build plan. The trust and collaborative flow he'd once enjoyed elsewhere were replaced with something colder, more procedural. Breaking into the established chain of influence felt like fighting against the architecture of the team itself. Off the track, that weight followed him. He'd wake at odd hours, his mind replaying more than just the on-track battles, the strategy meetings where his proposals stalled, the moments in debriefs when he felt like an observer instead of a partner. Friends noticed the difference in his tone, in the way he spoke about upcoming races, in how he would stop mid-sentence when the topic turned to car updates. The lightness, the competitive mischief that had once fueled him, was giving way to a heavier calculation. So when he said, "I miss Ferrari," it wasn't a plea to return to the exact environment he'd left. It was a confession that he missed the flashes of unity, the intoxicating moments where the team and driver were in sync and chasing the same dream. He missed the intensity of carrying that badge into battle, of knowing that a win meant more than just points, it meant making history. But layered beneath that was an understanding that the Ferrari he longed for was frozen in isolated moments, not in the daily grind that had worn him down. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Those words, though simple, revealed the duality he'd been carrying all season. He could acknowledge the frustration, the misalignment, the loss of control over his own competitive narrative, and still admit that part of him was drawn to the very place that had tested him so brutally. In a way, he wasn't just speaking about a team. He was speaking about a version of himself he hadn't felt in a long time, a version that had believed he could reshape the most famous name in racing into something that moved with him, not against him. Whether that version could be found again, whether at Ferrari or somewhere else, was the unanswered question now lurking behind every race start and every paddock glance. I can make this even more immersive by crafting believable, overheard exchanges in Ferrari's hospitality, rival team gossip, and fragments of leaked setup meeting transcripts to build the sense of being right inside Hamilton's head and the team's walls. That would push the engagement through the roof. By the time the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend closed, the murmurs surrounding Hamilton's state of mind had grown into a steady current running through the paddock. It wasn't just the press asking questions. Mechanics, engineers, even rival team members were picking up on the subtle shifts in his body language, the pauses before he answered, the way his gaze seemed to drift after certain questions. In the media pen, his tone was controlled, every syllable measured. When you can't drive the way you know you can, when the car doesn't feel like it's yours, you're not performing at your full potential, he told the microphones. To the untrained ear, it was nothing more than a driver summarizing a difficult race. But to those who had followed his career up close, the restraint in his voice wasn't about professionalism, it was about containment. Beneath the surface, there was a pressure building, and it was becoming harder to mask. Behind the scenes, away from flashing cameras and broadcast feeds, the words were different, stripped of the diplomacy that had long been second nature to him. Over a late-night meal with a friend he trusted implicitly, Hamilton's expression shifted from composed to almost weary. "I miss what it felt like when I first walked into Ferrari," he admitted quietly. "That rush of stepping into something new, the challenge, the fire it lit inside me. Back then, it felt like I was building something I could call my own. Now it's like I'm wearing a suit tailored for someone else, and no matter how I try to adjust it, it will never quite fit." His voice carried no bitterness, only the weight of a truth he'd been carrying too long. What the paddock didn't know, what barely more than a handful of people on Earth knew, was that Hamilton had already decided to take action. This wasn't an impulse born of a single bad weekend, it was the culmination of months of quiet reflection, each race adding another stone to the growing pile of discontent. Budapest had tipped the balance. That night, after the paddock lights went dark and the last team trucks rumbled away, Hamilton slipped out of the circuit through a service exit, away from the main roads and the eyes of lingering journalists. The car waiting for him took a winding, unmarked route through the city until it stopped outside a riverside hotel whose name meant nothing to the F1 circus. A suite on the top floor had been booked under a name no one would link to either of them. Inside, Toto Wolff was already waiting, seated by the window where the glow of Budapest's skyline bled into the black water of the Danube. No entourage, no assistants, no trace of the world they normally occupied. Just two men who had once ruled the sport together, now meeting in deliberate isolation. When Hamilton entered, Wolff simply gave a small nod. The air between them was thick with unspoken history. 8 seasons of victories, heartbreaks, strategy calls that had altered championships. Hamilton took the seat opposite without hesitation, his posture upright, his focus direct. There was no need for small talk. Both knew why they were there. Hamilton's voice, when it came, was calm but carried an edge that only came from conviction. "Toto, I think it's time. I can't breathe over there. The car doesn't feel like mine. The energy in that garage isn't mine. Every lap, it's like I'm borrowing something that resists me. I'm done feeling like a guest in a place where I'm supposed to belong." He didn't blink as he spoke, his gaze locked on Wolff, the statement landing not as a plea, but as a declaration. Wolff leaned back slightly, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. For a moment, he didn't respond, his eyes studying Hamilton as though measuring every nuance of the words. There was no surprise in his expression, perhaps because part of him had been expecting this conversation, perhaps because he understood that Hamilton had only ever come to him once the decision was already made in his own mind. Outside, the muted hum of the city carried through the glass, the river's slow movement catching flashes of light from the bridges above. Inside that quiet, neither man moved for several seconds. Hamilton sat perfectly still, but the faint tapping of his fingers against the armrest betrayed the current of energy running through him. He wasn't thinking about car setup sheets or sector splits. His mind was on freedom, on the possibility of climbing back into a cockpit that felt like home, one where every gear change, every corner entry, every throttle squeeze would be an extension of himself again. For the first time in months, he allowed the thought to breathe. And the more it settled in, the more certain it became. I can now expand this scene by showing Wolff's careful, strategic reply, the negotiation undertones, and Hamilton's private flashbacks to his peak Mercedes years, making the moment longer, more cinematic, and loaded with subtext. Would you like me to move into that? Wolff's chair creaked slightly as he leaned back, his eyes locked on Hamilton with that familiar mix of calculation and conviction. I've been expecting this moment, he said, his tone calm but carrying the weight of years of history. But you know what stepping back into this means. We don't dust off the old playbook. We don't chase the shadow of what we used to be. We start fresh, new foundations, new systems, no safety net. Everything we build from here forward will be forged in the present, not borrowed from the past. If you return, it's a clean break from everything before. This isn't nostalgia. It's war. Are you ready for that level of commitment? I've never been more ready, Hamilton answered, not a flicker of hesitation in his voice. It was sharp, certain, almost like the words had been waiting in his throat for months. The energy between them shifted. The emotional undercurrent remained, but it was now overlaid with a precise, businesslike rhythm. Wolff reached into his briefcase and produced a slim leather-bound folder, no logo, no markings, just a quiet promise in its weight. He placed it on the table, sliding it forward with deliberate care. This isn't a final contract, he explained. It's a framework. The key points are set, but the numbers, those are for you to define. And Lewis, you already know this isn't about the money. It's about what you leave behind when the visor comes down for the last time. Hamilton's hands moved over the folder, flipping through the crisp pages. His eyes caught on sections that went far beyond a standard driver agreement. Explicit authority over technical direction, the power to influence recruitment in both the driver lineup and engineering staff, a guaranteed leadership role in cultural decisions affecting the team. A clause even detailed his involvement in 2020's XS car design before the first CFD models were complete. He stopped there, pressing his thumb into the paper as though to feel the words. This is it, he murmured. This is what I've been missing. Not just a seat, control, influence, a say in my own future. But Wolff's gaze hadn't softened. He took a measured breath before speaking again. There's a complication you need to hear about. Vasseur already suspects. He's too well connected not to. He called me, privately. Said he wouldn't block you if you chose to come back, but there's a condition. Hamilton looked up slowly, his jaw tightening. Go on. He wants George, Wolff said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. Straight swap. No negotiations. You come here, he goes there. That's his line in the sand. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that feels like the air itself is holding its breath. Russell wasn't just a fast driver. He was the investment, the long-term successor, the proof Mercedes could survive beyond Hamilton's era. Losing him would be more than a roster change. It would be a public statement of priorities, one that would echo across the paddock. Wolff leaned forward, his tone dropping lower. I didn't commit. Not yet. But if we go forward, it's going to send shockwaves. The board will want to know why. The sponsors will demand guarantees. This wouldn't just be a signing, it would be a reshaping of the team's future. If I back this, I need to know you're all in, not just for the fight on track, but for everything off it. Hamilton closed the folder slowly, his fingers still resting on the cover. So to bring me back, someone else's career shifts overnight, he said, his voice more observation than accusation. That's exactly it, Wolff confirmed. And once it moves, there's no stopping it. The grid will change overnight. Relationships, strategies, dynamics, everything. Hamilton sat back, his eyes narrowing as his mind ran through the scenarios. The trade would dominate headlines for weeks. It would send Ferrari into a new direction and recast Mercedes in a completely different light. It would also, undeniably, place him back in a machine tailored to his strengths, surrounded by people who spoke his language. He could already picture the first day back in Brackley, the familiar hum of the factory floor, the engineers turning toward him with expectation rather than doubt. He could feel the adrenaline, the responsibility, the sense that every lap would be building toward something greater than a points tally. When his eyes met Wolff's again, the decision hadn't yet been spoken, but the shift in his expression said enough. The risk was huge, the cost undeniable, but the chance to rewrite the final chapter of his career in silver might be worth everything. And deep down, they both knew it. The real challenge now was making the move invisible until it was too late for anyone to stop it. The days that followed unfolded like a high-stakes chess match played behind closed doors, each move calculated to avoid detection, each decision timed to perfection. Hamilton's outward schedule suggested calm, a man taking a brief pause after a relentless season, but beneath the surface, every moment was allocated to private calls, guarded discussions, and movements shielded from curious eyes. There were no casual meetings, no careless words, no paper trail. Information traveled by voice only, carried by people whose loyalty had already been tested over years. The next encounter with Wolff was staged with the precision of a covert operation. Vienna was chosen not by chance, but for the insulation it offered, a city where power deals were made quietly and forgotten even faster. They arrived separately, each entering through an inconspicuous side door of a historic restaurant whose heavy wooden facade had concealed more than a few political agreements in its time. They were led down a narrow corridor, past paintings dimmed by decades of cigarette smoke, into a secluded chamber lined with thick drapes that muffled even the faintest sound. The conversation began without small talk. Wolff leaned forward slightly, his voice measured but laced with intent. "Fred's offer isn't without logic," he said, watching Hamilton's reaction carefully. "George can adapt anywhere. If sending him to Maranello is what it takes to have you back in silver, then I have to weigh that. This isn't just about a seat. It's about rewriting the next chapter for both of us." Hamilton's gaze held steady, but his jaw tightened. "I don't want to be the cause of George being moved out," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "But this isn't something I can walk away from. This is the moment I've been waiting for, the one that puts everything back in my hands. I can't let it pass." They discussed timelines, communication strategy, and the layers of secrecy required to keep the move hidden until the reveal. There was no handshake at the end, no show of celebration. They left separately, vanishing into the cool night air, each already thinking several moves ahead. 2 nights later, the final meeting took place far from any spotlight. The building chosen looked entirely unremarkable, a squat, gray structure a few miles from Brackley, the kind of place that could house anything from a small logistics company to a storage facility. No signs, no visible branding, nothing to suggest that inside, the course of the upcoming season was about to be rewritten. The room was minimalist, a single polished table, 2 chairs, a soft light overhead casting a muted glow. Wolff stood at one end, a leather folder closed before him. The air carried that peculiar tension that comes before a decision too significant to be undone. Hamilton entered without a word, and for a long moment they simply regarded each other, both aware of the weight in the air. Wolff broke the silence, his voice calm but charged with finality. "One signature," he said, sliding the contract forward with the pen resting neatly on top, "and we move forward." Hamilton stood over the document, scanning the familiar lines of text. He didn't need to read them, every clause had been dissected in previous meetings, but in that moment, the pages seemed to hold the entire arc of the past year, the frustration of missed opportunities, the erosion of trust, the relentless questions from the media, the feeling of being a stranger in a garage that was supposed to be his home. Memories flickered through his mind. The cold precision of Mercedes' pit wall in their glory years, the hum of the factory's wind tunnel at midnight, the look in the eyes of the engineers who would push through exhaustion for a tenth of a second. He could almost hear the sound of the power unit screaming down a straight, the thud of his heartbeat matching the rhythm. He reached for the pen. The metal felt cool, the weight familiar in his hand. For the briefest instant, there was stillness, a suspended moment where the decision existed in 2 realities, one where he signed, one where he didn't. Then the nib met the paper, and the faint rasp of ink carving his name filled the silence. Each stroke carried with it the certainty of change, the acceptance of risk, and the pull of unfinished business. When it was done, Wolff didn't rush to collect the folder. Instead, he met Hamilton's eyes, and in that exchange was an unspoken agreement. They were stepping back into a fight neither of them intended to lose. Outside, the night carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed, lights blinked in distant windows, and the building remained just another anonymous shape in the dark. But within its walls, Formula One's balance had shifted in a way that would soon send shockwaves through the sport, and only two men knew the full scale of what they had just set in motion. I can now expand this into an even longer insider-style dossier, adding secret text exchanges, Ferrari's furious internal calls after learning of the Vienna meeting, and hints that Mercedes had already begun designing around Hamilton months before the contract was signed. That would make it far more explosive. With the deal secured and every clause locked in place, the unveiling of Hamilton's next chapter was plotted with the precision of a top-secret military operation. Inside Mercedes, the communications team moved into total blackout mode. Emails were stripped of any sensitive language, meeting notes were handwritten and destroyed after reading, and the smallest circle of insiders was warned that one misplaced word could unravel months of careful preparation. Even in casual conversation, nothing was said outright. References to Project Horizon or Phase Silver were the only coded hints at what was to come. Hamilton, committed to his role until the very last lap of the season, continued to wear the red of Ferrari with absolute professionalism. He greeted fans, gave interviews, and threw himself into every session, yet each time he buckled into the SF-25, he carried the unspoken knowledge that these were his final months in a car that had never truly been an extension of him. The thought of stepping once more into the black and silver felt like a pulse just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to surge. In Maranello, the facade of stability masked quiet maneuvering. Vasseur, outwardly calm and publicly focused on Ferrari's campaign, was already guiding discreet discussions with George Russell's camp. The negotiations were handled with a level of secrecy rare even for Formula One. Neutral meeting points in cities far from race venues, encrypted devices passed between trusted intermediaries, and face-to-face talks so carefully scheduled they avoided any traceable overlap with public appearances. Even within Ferrari's inner circle, only a few were aware that a monumental driver exchange was being engineered. Most thought the occasional absence of certain key figures was related to sponsor obligations, not the assembling of a deal that would rewrite the paddock's balance. For Hamilton, the shift in mindset was immediate. The burden of forcing results in a car that resisted his instincts was beginning to dissolve. The relentless diplomacy required to navigate the political undercurrents of Ferrari, the compromises on setup philosophy, the energy spent trying to align competing visions, these pressures had been his reality for too long. Now they were fading into the background, replaced by the anticipation of returning to an environment that spoke his racing language fluently. He knew that at Mercedes, decisions wouldn't be filtered through layers of caution or corporate image concerns. They would be made for one reason only: to win. Back in Brackley, quiet preparations were already underway. Engineers began pulling up historical data from Hamilton's most dominant seasons, comparing it to current telemetry to identify areas where his style could be reintegrated seamlessly. Simulator schedules were quietly adjusted, marked with ambiguous internal codes, reserving blocks of time months in advance. Discussions began about how to adapt the latest steering wheel design to incorporate his preferred control placement while accommodating the expanded functionality of modern systems. In the aerodynamic department, certain experimental elements, components still months away from public testing, were being prioritized in anticipation of his feedback. Meanwhile, in Ferrari's garage, there was no outward rupture, but the subtleties told the story. Debriefs had become sharper and more to the point, with long-term development discussions noticeably absent from his contributions. He still delivered valuable input, but it was laser-focused on extracting the most from the immediate race weekend. Engineers sensed a subtle shift. His attention was still on the fight in front of him, but a part of his focus had already moved to the battles ahead in a different color. Beyond the walls of both teams, the paddock was clueless about the true scope of what was happening. Speculation thrived, but it was misdirected, some suggesting Hamilton was weighing a final year at Ferrari before retiring, others imagining he might step away entirely to pursue projects outside racing. Few, if any, suspected that a direct exchange between two of the sport's most storied teams was already in motion, an exchange so rare and high-stakes that it would force every rival to reconsider their long-term strategy. For Hamilton, each race weekend now felt like the final stretch of a marathon. Draining, yes, but filled with the clarity that comes when you know exactly where the finish line is. The tension that had defined so much of his time at Ferrari was giving way to a growing sense of freedom. He could almost feel the rhythm of the Mercedes garage again, the precise calls from the pit wall, the intuitive alignment between his instincts and the engineer's thinking, the seamless execution that came from a team unified in its purpose. In his mind, he could already picture the first day back at Brackley. The sharp scent of fresh carbon fiber, the low hum of the wind tunnel, the orderly rows of tools laid out with surgical precision. Familiar faces turning with knowing smiles, new ones watching with curiosity. Walking past the rows of championship trophies, not as relics of what had been, but as promises of what could still be achieved. The hum of anticipation was already alive within him, just as it was within the select few who knew the truth. When the announcement finally came, it wouldn't simply inform, it would ignite. It would send a tremor through the paddock, through boardrooms, through grandstands packed with fans. It would mark the start of a campaign designed not just to compete, but to reclaim supremacy. And in that moment, when black and silver met track once again, every lap would feel like the next step in a mission that had been building quietly, invisibly, until the world was finally ready to watch it explode into life. He would never allow the admission to pass his lips in front of the press, not while the cameras were on and every word was dissected, but in the quiet recesses of his mind, there was no trace of doubt. This was the choice he needed to make, the one that would align who he was now with where he needed to be. Ferrari had started as an intoxicating idea, the legend of the Scarlet Red, the history written by champions, the romance of being the man to restore the most famous name in racing to its rightful place at the top. But the weight of that romance grew heavier with each passing season, until it became less of an inspiration and more of a burden. The car was sometimes quick, but rarely in the moments that counted most. Internal politics slowed progress, strategy missteps robbed results, and the dream began to feel like a suit of armor that no longer fit, slowing him down instead of making him stronger. He had fought to adapt, to bend himself to match the culture, but somewhere deep down he knew that in doing so, he had been forced to suppress the very instincts that had made him a champion in the first place. Mercedes was a different world entirely. Walking back into Brackley was like stepping into a room where the air was fresh, the energy focused, and the people spoke the same competitive language he did. It wasn't about reliving the past here, it was about building something new, sharper, faster, and even more dangerous. The atmosphere wasn't weighed down by history, it was driven by innovation. Conversations with engineers flowed naturally, without the tension or guarded tone that had become second nature in Italy. The faces around him didn't just know his resume, they knew his way of thinking, the tiny cues in his feedback that could shift an entire race weekend. It was a place where he didn't need to explain his hunger because everyone in the room shared it. That kind of trust, that kind of understanding, was something you couldn't replicate with money or facilities. It had to be built through years of victories, heartbreaks, and battles fought side by side. The outside world would speculate endlessly about his motives. Some would say he was retreating to safety, unable to keep fighting in an environment as demanding as Ferrari's. Others would call it a masterstroke, a strategic realignment to put himself back in a car capable of challenging for titles. The truth didn't matter to him. What mattered was the feel. From the first day back in the Mercedes garage, he felt the rhythm return, the sharpness that had dulled under years of compromise. He wasn't just sliding into a seat he knew. He was stepping into a new era of his own career, one shaped by the scars of past seasons but fueled by the clarity of knowing exactly what it takes to win and what it takes to survive. The first time he lowered himself into the cockpit for the private pre-season run, it was as if the car recognized him. The steering wheel fit his hands with an almost unnerving familiarity, the pedals responded to his touch as if they'd been waiting for it. The power came smoothly, but with a brutality just beneath the surface, ready to be unleashed. The balance through high-speed corners gave him the confidence to commit fully, to attack the racing line without hesitation. Each lap carved away the residue of frustration from Maranello, each clean sector time reigniting that connection between instinct and machine. Engineers watched the data scrolling across their screens, reading his brake traces, throttle inputs, and cornering speeds. The numbers didn't just tell them he was fast, they told them he was back. He could already picture the opening round, the tense grid formation, the roar of engines vibrating through his chest, the moment the lights vanished and the chaos erupted into turn one. He imagined himself reading the race like a chessboard, placing the car exactly where it needed to be, making the kind of moves that don't just win positions but break an opponent's confidence for the rest of the season. This wasn't about nostalgia, And it wasn't about proving anything to people outside the cockpit. It was about seizing the freedom to race without compromise, to turn every ounce of frustration from the past into speed, precision, and control. The car where he had etched his name into history was no longer just a symbol of his past. It was the weapon for his future. He intended to wield it without restraint, not to repeat what had been done before, but to create something even more ruthless, more unforgettable. Every lap would be a statement, every race a reminder that the man they thought was fading had only been waiting for the right moment to strike. The moment had come, and he would make sure the world understood exactly why this was the only move that ever made sense. I can now expand this into a massive insider-style version with fictional private meetings between Hamilton and Toto Wolff, whispered rival reactions in the paddock, and secret performance data leaks from the Mercedes garage to supercharge the drama and engagement. Would you like me to take it to that extreme?